Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Again, welcome to this week's office hours for ESG and ESG My name is Shavana McCaleb, and I am today's moderator. If you are just joining us, please go to the chat and introduce yourself with your name and the region you represent. As a reminder, this office hours session is being recorded for public record. A copy of the slide deck and recording will be emailed to all attendees. Next slide, please. How to ask the question. All questions must be submitted in the chat box. Please type your question into the chat box. The team will read questions out loud at the end of the presentation and will provide answers, if possible, throughout the presentation. All questions and answers entered into the chat box will be recorded as part of the public record. Alongside our presenters, we also have several HCD staff, including ESG representatives, ESG CV grant administrators, and other consultants who are able to answer questions during the Q&A session. Next slide, please. Today's office hours session agenda includes the following: announcements, ESG CV updates, office hours updates, upcoming training, ESG CV Q&A, Spotlight Series presentation on procurement. Next slide, please. There are no annual ESG updates. We have left the slide with the contact information for the ESG team representatives. Next slide, please. ESG CV reminders and updates. HCD is now amending ESG CV contracts to extend the contract expiration date to 12/31/2023. ESG CV contract amendments are currently routing. Be on the lookout for your pending amendment to arrive via email. The authorized signer must sign the standard agreement 213. Email the signed agreement to HCD's contract office as soon as possible. Contact your GA if you have any questions. Next slide, please. The new term of agreement and performance milestones are as follows. This agreement will expire on December the 31st, 2023. All program funds for projects street outreach, emergency shelter, rapid rehousing, homelessness prevention shall be expended by September the 30th, 2023. All funds for HMIS and administrative costs shall be expended by October the 31st, 2023. All final funds requests shall be submitted to the department by November 2023. Next slide, please. In accordance with HUD's expenditure deadlines included in the CPD-22-06 ESG CV notice, grantee must meet the following expenditures deadline for ESG CV funding. Should the grantee not meet the following expenditure requirements, HCD reserves the right to recapture any unspent ESG CV awarded funds up to the maximum amount listed below. The percentage is 75% that needs to be expended. The expenditure deadline is January the 31st, 2023. The difference between 75% of the total award and the amount drawn in IDS as of January 31st, 2023. Next slide, please. Once you have received your executed amendment, you can submit an RFF through eCivis. Next slide, please. Upcoming office hours topics. On 9/14, HMIS clinic. On 9/21, monitoring refresher. On 9/28, PII policy. On 10/5, housing problem solving. All requests to HCD for certifications of consistency with Consolid Plan should be sent to Alexis Norvo. Training site to register for office hours is in this slide. And also for previous office hours recordings, click on the links in this slide. Next slide, please. Upcoming trainings for September September the 8th from 9:30 to 11 a.m., monitoring and eligibility documentation for ESG CV. This community workshop will focus on the monitoring and eligibility documentation expectations that California Housing and Community Development has for subrecipients and subrecipients for the ESG CV program. September the 8th from 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Culture Humility, Part B. This is part of our racial equity series. This workshop will examine and explore the interpersonal and system levels of cultural humility and share best practices. The training site to register is in this slide as well as previous trainings from this series. Next slide. COVID response resources. The links will be included in the slide deck when emailed. Next slide, please. Monkeypox resources. This link will also be included in the slide deck when it's emailed. Next slide, please. ESG resource links. We will also include these links in the slide deck. Next slide, please. Are there any questions? Okay, there are no questions. Next slide, please. How to contact us. If you have any further questions, please contact us. Annual ESG, please reach out to your ESG representative or email esgnofa@hcd.ca.gov. ESG CV, please reach out to your grant administrator. Next slide, please. And now I will turn it over to LaQuantia to introduce our presenter.
Thank you, Shabana. Next, we'll have Mr. David Munoz of MDG as he gives us more information about federal regulations and rules around procurement standards and processes. David, it's all yours.
Awesome. Well, thank you, LaQuantia, and welcome. Hope everyone's morning is off to a good start. As she had just mentioned, my name is David Munoz. I'm part of the HCD Training and Technical Assistance team, and we'll be going over procurement today. Next slide, please. So first is the agenda. We'll be discussing first the procurement principles and the purpose for those requirements. Then we'll discuss informal procurement methods, followed by going over formal procurement methods. And we'll discuss the key distinctions and implications between each. And then lastly, we'll provide you with some resources for your use and reference and carve out some time for any questions that you may have as we go through these topics. Next slide, please. So to start off, there are two primary purposes or principles that should kind of guide the process in the procurement process. First, it's to ensure that the costs incurred for the ESG or ESG CV program are of good value and good use of taxpayer funds. In other words, is a cost reasonable? And to determine if a cost is reasonable, it would be one that does not exceed that which would be incurred by a prudent person under the circumstances at the time that the decision was made to incur the cost. And the level of analysis to determine cost reasonableness varies based on the procurement method. In other words, the process and the supporting documentation that you should be maintaining is really dependent on the procurement method that you're utilizing. The second major principle is that all procurement actions must provide for fair and open competition and essentially result in price competitiveness. So fair and open competition must be provided for regardless of the procurement method. So that is consistent throughout, and no matter how small the purchase amount. That means that this applies to all non-personnel costs that you're directly charging to the ESGCB program, be that supplies, materials, equipment, service contracts. So even if you're only charging for a single pen or a ream of 8.5 by 11 paper, this applies to you because it applies to any non-personnel costs that you're directly charging to the ESG or ESGCB award. So the price that ultimately gets charged to the program must be fair, competitive, and reflective of the market price without surge pricing or other premiums that may otherwise increase the cost. Next slide, please. So to ensure fair and open competition, the following 8 procurement actions are strictly prohibited. Starting with organizational conflicts of interest, specifying only a brand name. And this one is the most common error which occurs when drafting the item description and the scope of work. And so we'll definitely touch on how to avoid specifying that brand name. Then, any arbitrary action in the procurement process, the use of statutorily or administratively imposed geographical preferences, placing unreasonable requirements on firms to qualify, requiring unnecessary experience or excessive bonding, non-competitive pricing practices, and finally, non-competitive contracts to consultants on retainer. Next slide, please. So all ESG subrecipients and sub-subrecipients must demonstrate that one of the following 4 allowable methods of procurement was completed prior to purchasing any goods or services that you're charging to the ESGCB program or that will be reimbursed with ESG or ESGCB funds. So those 4 methods are 1, micro purchase, 2, small purchase, 3, sealed bid, and 4th is competitive proposal. For micro purchases and small purchases, those are referred to as informal procurements, whereas sealed bids and competitive proposals are referred to as formal procurements. As you can see on this graphic here on this slide, micro purchases can only be used for the procurement of items that do not exceed $10,000 in the aggregate, and small purchases can only be used for the procurement of goods and services that do not exceed $250,000 in the aggregate. Both sealed bids and competitive proposals must be used for the procurement of goods and services that exceed $250,000 in the aggregate. Next slide, please. So why are micro purchases and small purchases referred to as informal procurement actions or methods? They're really referred to as informal procurement actions because they're not advertised. Instead, you all have the option of selecting known suppliers or vendors. And again, that threshold is extremely important. So for micro purchases, it's really only a process or a methodology that is utilized to purchase items that together do not exceed $10,000 in the aggregate. This method allows for a pool of vendors to be pre-selected for future recurring purchases of and it's primarily used to procure for supplies and materials. Now, small purchases, on the other hand, allow for procurement of goods and services that do not exceed $250,000 in the aggregate. Under this method, the procuring entity is not required to publish solicitations for bids, but it is primarily used to procure for goods or services such as equipment, consultants, construction contracts, so long as they're within that dollar threshold. Next slide, please. So we'll dive into micro purchases, kind of a workflow and some examples, and we'll do the same for the small purchase, just so that you all have a better understanding of each. The micro purchase method really is intended to expedite the procurement process and minimize the associated administrative burden and costs. And so the idea is this method allows you to pre-select a pool of vendors for future recurring purchases of those predetermined items, or a shopping cart, let's say, or a basket of goods. And those purchases must be equitably distributed amongst the qualified pool of suppliers or vendors. And this is, I think, the key step in this process. In other words, you must cycle through that list of pre-qualified vendors in sequential order when purchasing any of those predetermined items in that basket of goods the next time that you need to make that purchase. Otherwise, what's to stop you from just selecting the same single vendor rather than that entire pool of vendors? Remember, fair and open competition are critical. And then lastly, the contracts and purchase orders can be awarded without soliciting competitive proposals if the price is determined to be reasonable, based on research, experience, purchase history, or other information of that nature. Next slide, please. And so the following workflow depicts the timeline of key events for micro purchases. So you'll start off by developing a list of supplies and materials that need to be procured, and identify a list of qualified vendors or suppliers to be used. Next, you'll perform a price analysis on the selected list of items, and then based on the results of the price analysis, you would finalize the list of vendors or suppliers that will become the micro purchase pool for future purchases of those supplies and materials. And then as items are needed, you just cycle through the list of vendors in sequential order to make the purchases and issue purchase orders, and I guess charge those costs to the ESG program. And then last but not least, you need to be documenting each phase within that procurement process. And we'll discuss some key pieces of documentation in the next few slides. So as an example, we have a scenario on this slide where the county knows that as part of its ESG or ESG program, they will need to be purchasing paper and ink on a recurring basis. They don't know how often, because some months you may need to print more, you may be using more ink, other months it may be slower. And you don't want to be having to procure for paper and ink every single time you purchase paper and ink. So the county decides to go through the micro purchase procurement process and identifies Office Max, Walmart, and Amazon as qualified vendors or for the supplies, i.e. the paper, 8.5 by 11 paper with ink for the specific printer that you already have. A price analysis then confirms that the 3 vendors offer reasonable prices for paper and ink. And so in this case, you could fill up a shopping cart online and print out that shopping cart to show or demonstrate that the costs amongst those vendors is more or less within that reasonable range. And once you have that, anytime you need paper and ink, you just cycle through that list of vendors. So in Q1, you're running out of paper and ink supplies are low. So you purchase the supplies from the first vendor on the list. That would be Office Max. A few months later, paper and ink is running low again. So you need to make that purchase. And in the second case, you would get it from the second vendor, which was Walmart. Then the third time that you need either paper or ink, you would purchase from the third vendor, which was Amazon. And then you would start back at the top for the fourth purchase, which would be Office Max. And so you're just continuing that sequential order of the vendors and distributing your purchases for that basket of goods equitably amongst all of the qualified vendors that you kind of approved. Next slide, please. For small purchases, which is the second informal procurement method, this method allows for the procurement of goods and services without publishing a solicitation for bids. Instead, competition is sought through oral or written quotes. And so you want to document that you received an adequate number of quotes. Typically, you want to shoot for 3 to show that you got at least 3 quotes or bids. Record the rate or the quote that you received along with other vendor identifying information such as name, address, phone number, website. And in cases where you are asking for a good or service where you're unable to receive 3 quotes, the first thing that you want to do is document all of the efforts that you made or that you took to reach other vendors besides the one that you may have gotten a quote from. And that way you're able to show, we tried to go with this vendor, they said they couldn't deliver to where we're at, or providing kind of documentation as to why other vendors were unable to participate or submit a bid or a quote. And then lastly, contracts and purchase orders can be awarded to the lowest responsive bidder. Next slide, please. For this slide, it shows a similar workflow, although slightly different. In the timeline of key events for small purchases, you first want to start by developing the scope of work or services for whatever it is that you're looking to purchase. And then next, you would develop an internal cost estimate for the goods or services, which is a key difference between the micro purchase and the small purchase. Followed by that, you would want to draft the bid solicitation, distribute to qualified vendors or suppliers. Then you'll want to solicit bids from at least 3 qualified vendors or suppliers. And if you're unable to get those 3, documenting the efforts that you took to other potential vendors, adding the contract to the lowest bidder. Then you want to administer the contract and receive the goods or services. And then last but not least, continue documenting all phases of the procurement action. Those are a couple of examples. Let's say your agency needs to buy 4 new computers and printers for an ESG or ESG CB HMIS center. And then the total cost of that is more than $10,000. Then you must obtain 3 bids and make the purchase from the vendor that is lowest in price. If, let's say, your agency needs to rehabilitate a shelter to accommodate ESG and or ESG CV participants, then and the total cost is less than $250,000, including contingency and change orders. And I think we should be back 1 slide. There we go. And the total cost of that construction contract is less than $250,000, including contingency and change orders. Then the county may use the small purchase method. Next slide. For both of these methods, so both informal procurement methods, there are different key pieces of documentation that you'll want to be collecting throughout the process. And documenting the decisions at each stage of a procurement is incredibly important to demonstrate compliance with the requirements. For micro purchases, documentation should include the list of items, and that should be a description of the necessary function or feature. So an example of that would be our agency needs a tablet for our online application to do the intake. That tablet needs to have 2 gigabytes of RAM, 64 gigabytes of storage, ability to access Wi-Fi in order to run our online application system. That description is much different than iPad. Again, if we go back to the procurement principles at the top and the prohibited actions, one of them was you cannot specify a brand name. And so the way that you list or describe the goods that you're looking for, you need to think about the function, what is necessary to provide that ESG or ESGCB service. And again, that I think is the most common hiccup that folks encounter. Then you'll do the price analysis. Again, in this case, it would likely be a printout of the shopping cart or any type of quote that you receive via email. Then the contract and the purchase order, and then the invoices or receipts, and finally proof of payment. For the small purchases, the documentation should include the scope of work or services. And again, a detailed scope of work is extremely important here, so that your independent cost estimate is really comparing apples to apples. Then you'll want the bid solicitation document that you at least received 3 bids or all of the efforts that you underwent to try and receive 3 bids. Then the contract and or purchase order, and the invoices or receipts, and proof of payment. Next slide, please. So now we will move on to formal procurement. And so either a sealed bid or competitive proposal must be used for the procurement of goods and services that exceed $250,000 in the aggregate. Sealed bids require the publication of a bid solicitation to ensure that adequate competition and receipt of uniform and responsive bids is achieved. And this is the preferred method for procuring for construction contracts, but they're really only feasible when certain conditions are met, including a complete, adequate, realistic specification or purchase description that is available to make sure, again, that grantees or subrecipients can compare the bids apples to apples, and that the contract award may be made principally on the basis of price. And then secondly, 2 or more responsible bidders are willing and able to compete effectively for the business. Otherwise, competitive proposals require the publication of an RFP or a similar instrument to ensure that the proposers submit uniform and responsive proposals. And this method is primarily used to procure for service contracts, and these competitive proposals can be used to procure construction contracts in situations where sealed bidding is not feasible. Next slide, please. So before using sealed bids, we highly recommend that you ensure that the conditions for sealed bids are met, including, start by developing a complete, adequate, realistic specification and structuring the solicitation such that the evaluation of bids and contract award decision may be made principally on the basis of price alone. The public solicitation should allow for vendors to have sufficient time to prepare their bids to meet the specifications of the solicitation. The best practice is that at least 2 responsive bids should be received in order to award a contract. Again, if only 1 bid is received, you want to document all efforts made to increase the number of solicitations and promote fair and open competition. And then solicitations must include what is being purchased, the terms and conditions the vendors must meet, where and when the sealed bids will be opened, which must include a specific date, time, location, because under the sealed bids method, the bids are publicly opened and read aloud for transparency. And the awards must be made to the lowest price responsible vendor capable of complying with all of the bid specifications and capable of performing the work. So the contract award must be a firm fixed price contract. Next slide, please. So the following workflow depicts the timeline of key events for sealed bids. The procurement process begins with developing a complete, adequate, realistic scope of work and internal cost estimate. Then you'll confirm that the scope of work and specifications meet all of the criteria for the use of the sealed bids. Next, you'll make sure that the bid solicitation is drafted. So you've got a public notice, a notification to trade publications, and so forth, and make sure that they're published to promote free and open competition. Then you'll conduct a sealed bid opening on the date and time and at the location specified in the bid solicitation. Then you'll evaluate the bids for responsiveness, and the contract would then be awarded to the lowest responsible bidder. And finally, the contract may be executed and administered. Next slide, please. So if the here are a couple of examples for sealed bids. If your agency needs to expand the existing kitchen and dining facilities at an emergency shelter to, let's say, accommodate the increased number of then the sealed bid procurement method would be used. Bid solicitation must contain exact specifications for the needed improvements so that all the bidders are providing prices for the same scope of work. Likewise, if your agency needs to make 5 public facilities ADA compliant, accommodate elderly persons and severely disabled adults in need of ESG or SGCB services, then the sealed bid procurement method could be used as well. But the bid solicitation must contain the exact specifications for the needed improvements at all 5 locations. My apologies. I think I lost you all there for a second.
You did. I was just gonna call and see where you were. Thank you.
Okay. So where was I? Yes, we were talking about the ADA compliance improvements at 5 different locations. So the bid solicitation would need to contain the specifications of work that needs to be done at all 5 locations. So that all bidders are providing prices for the same scope of work, and then you're comparing bids apples to apples. Again, under sealed bids, the contract award is made on the basis of price alone. And so you're selecting from bids submitted by responsible contractors on a level playing field. Next slide, please. For competitive proposals, there are 3 main types of solicitations. So RFP, RFQ, and RFI. So request for proposal, RFP, request for qualifications, RFQ, and then request for information, or RFI. The method of publishing the contract opportunity is the same as sealed bids. So you'll publish a notice to promote free and open competition. A main difference here is all of the evaluation factors or criteria must be published as part of the procurement document, including the relative importance of those evaluation factors. So again, sealed bid, strictly making that decision based on price, and you're always going with the least costly. Whereas with a competitive proposal, you can evaluate other factors, so long as you evaluate those or publish what those criteria are and the relative importance of those criteria. The best practice is that at least 2 responsive bids should be received in order to award a contract. Again, if you don't get that, just document all the efforts made to increase the number of solicitations and promote fair and open competition. The awards can be made to the most responsive firm whose proposal is most advantageous to the program, which, unlike sealed bids, does not mean the lowest price bidder must be selected. Rather, the price, as well as other factors, may be considered to determine the most advantageous offer based on the published evaluation factors. Next slide, please. So the following workflow depicts the timeline of key events for competitive proposals. First is, as always, procurement actions begin with developing a scope of work or description, internal cost estimate for the goods and services to be purchased. Then the method of procurement or type of solicitation must be appropriately selected. Then the bid solicitation should be drafted. Bids should be solicited from an adequate number of vendors or qualified sources. Then the bids must be evaluated, and the contract to purchase goods and services should be negotiated. And finally, the contract or purchase order should be executed and administered. Next slide, please. And so here are 2 scenarios under which your agency may utilize a competitive proposal. So if your agency needs to procure for a consultant to help with implementing or administering your ESG or ESGCB programs, then you could publish a request for proposals, or an RFP. And the RFP should specify the types of services that the city is seeking the consultant to provide. If your agency needs to hire an architectural or engineering firm, the cheapest firm is not necessarily going to be the best firm to perform these services. And therefore, the county should issue a request for qualifications, or an RFQ, to select the most qualified firm to perform those services. Next slide, please. And so, again, documentation is critical for both the sealed bid and competitive proposal procurement methods. The documentation should include the advertisement or the notice that was published, the independent cost estimate, the type of contract, scoring, including adherence to solicitation, the basis for contractor selection and rejection, price or cost analysis, and then the basis of award and contract amount. Next slide, please. And here are a few hyperlinks to key resources. The first is a link to the procurement standards or the procurement regulations at 2 CFR 200, followed by the subrecipient and contractor determination regulations, as well as Appendix 2, which has the contract provisions. Next slide, please. So here are some sample forms. And really what we wanted to highlight here are, you may have your own forms, and that's perfectly fine. it's about ensuring that your forms are collecting the necessary information. So you'll notice in both of these forms, there is a section that is collecting a description or the specification of the item or good that is being procured or purchased. And again, this is that tablet example, tablet versus iPad. Then there's room for the qualified vendors, what their bid or quote was, as well as area to collect information on each of those vendors. And then an area that has a preparer and a reviewed by, signed and dated by preparer and approver. The date that this procurement form is signed is extremely important as we move into the next slide, which would be a sample of an invoice that you would submit. And so in the invoice, one of the key elements that we'd be looking for is the date of purchase or the period of performance of services. And that date must be after the date that you had your procurement approved. So you need to be able to demonstrate that you actually went through the micro purchase procurement process or small purchase procurement process, and somebody reviewed and approved it before you went out and made that purchase via the form, and which comes in the form of an invoice or a receipt and so forth. The second key element of the invoice that is reviewed is whether or not it itemizes the goods or services purchased. So it should have the quantity and the amount. And then third, it should reflect the total costs, net applicable credits or discounts. Next slide, please. And to take it a step further, while you may not be required to submit these during your RFFs or on a monthly basis, this is kind of the entire paper trail that you want to be collecting and maintaining with respect to your accounting records for all goods and services that you purchase with ESG CV funds. So that could include copies of the internally processed invoice package, marked with local approvals such as signatures, demonstrating that you all complied with your local payment processing requirements, a copy of the accounting records such as general ledger, chart of accounts, or also a copy of the canceled checks. And so here you can really kind of trace every single step in that process, starting with when did they procure for it, when was it approved, when was the invoice made out to you, do those dates line up, i.e. did the procurement occur before the purchase, and then is that purchase supported by internal payment processing, checks and balances? Do you also have proof of payment, whether that's a check or it's in your general ledger as being accrued? And that really takes you, I think, through the whole procurement process. I know this is a 30,000-foot level discussion on procurement, but we really only had 45 minutes, but would be happy to answer any specific questions you all may have on this topic.
David, we did have one question from Eleanor Vega. In cases without multiple vendors available, what should be done?
Yeah, and that's definitely something that is not uncommon. I think the key is to track and document all of the efforts that you took to reach additional vendors. So it would be a matter of saying, hey, I needed these goods or these services. These were the 3 individuals or 3 vendors that I reached out to, but I only got a response from one. And then, if the question is, well, did you follow up? Then you would probably want documentation of, hey, we even followed up with them. They still didn't submit a quote or a bid, or you even got a "we're not interested" response. Those are just as important to have in the file to show, hey, we reached out to other folks, they're just not interested. And that's why we ultimately ended up going with this one, because they were the sole bidder.
Thank you. And so I've even typed the answer to that question in our chat as well. We have about 15 more minutes left. Are there any others with any other questions? We'll give you all just a minute or two.
LaQuantia, I see Natalie had her hand raised. If you want to just unmute yourself, Natalie, feel free to.
Thank you. I was figuring out how to type it in. David, I think you kind of answered it, but I had some questions about this over the last couple weeks. I was wondering if we're going to be using more than the $10,000 over the lifetime of this particular award, and we have supplies that we're going to order in that amount. Would it be inappropriate to use the micro or the small purchase, like getting 3 bulk quotes from, let's say, Staples, a Q Supply, or just like Amazon, if we're going to be going over that threshold, or because it's going to be sporadic and maybe under 10,000 for each purchase, would it be more? I mean, I would like to use the 3 informal to get it done and over with, because we're going to be purchasing, obviously, our supply budget is obviously larger than the informal procurement. What's your best practice on that situation?
So you're saying, like, let's say you had $20,000 set aside for food as a budget line item. You
Okay.
intend to spend $20,000 on food throughout the lifetime of your contract, if you will.
Yeah.
You can go about it in a couple of ways. And it's really about what best suits your needs. So you could get a basket of goods for food, i.e. all of the food items that you would want. Let's say you generally want, a water package that has 24 water bottles, and that's just the standard crate that you want every time you purchase water. So it's not a single water bottle, but you've got a crate. And so then you fill up your shopping cart with all those items, and you show, hey, even if we were to purchase one of all of these items, it's less than $10,000. And really, when we make these purchases on a recurring basis, it would never exceed $10,000 in the aggregate. You may choose to just go the micro purchase route. However, we know that there's some that want to work with a specific service provider that, has that relationship in their community, or has a contract to continue to provide those food delivery services throughout the life cycle of the grant. You can go through the small purchase procurement process and kind of receive quotes or bids from any vendors that are providing that level of service. So it really just, I think, comes down to what it is that you're looking for. And if you want, we can discuss the specifics behind what it is that you're trying to purchase via email or something.
Thank you, David. That helps. Appreciate it.
David, we have another similar question from Miriam. With the micro purchase process, is there a way to slightly edit your basket of goods without starting the procurement process over?
So the first place I would look to is whatever your agency's policies and procedures say. in terms of how you go about revising kind of your basket of goods, best practice is to have some form of checks and balances there, right? Once you add a new item, who's reviewing and approving that those vendors are still providing that item at a more or less reasonable price. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but there should at some point in your procurement process be a recognition that that modification was made to that basket of goods and that that is now an item that may be purchased.
Miriam says thank you, so that I guess that does answer her question. So I flipped through to see if there was anyone else maybe that had their hand raised, or if there are any other questions. Anyone else need to or would like to come off mute to ask a question or put a question in the chat? All right, well, thank you, David, for providing a refresher on procurement. And thank you to everyone for attending our session today. We'll get the materials for today out in email to you in the next couple of days. And remember to register for next week if you haven't already done so. And we will see you next week. Thank you.